Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Let's Build That App.com channel. And also, welcome to June of 2020, where apparently haircuts are no longer a thing. And on top of that, there's a lot of crazy issues going on out there in the real world. I don't want to make this channel too serious, so what I was thinking for today's video is to try and take your mind off of these serious issues, and instead we'll talk about something as trivial as building out an iOS application. So without further ado, let me give you a quick demo as to the application we'll work on in today's lesson. It might last for about 30 or maybe 45 minutes. I'll try to make it as quick as possible. So let me demo what this application does in the top right corner. What exactly do we have? Well, we have a couple of different sections inside of a single collection view. And I've been looking at the DoorDash application a lot lately, so I tried to take a stab at building out one of these applications here. And it's looking pretty good using one of the latest iOS 13 SDK libraries called Compositional Layout. Building this guy out is really simple now in 2020 and going forward. So let me demo exactly what this application does right here. We actually have a couple of different sections, right? Section on the top here, section number 2, section 3, and also a final section at the very bottom. Hopefully you guys can see what the heck is going on. But basically, this top section right here, section number 0, it allows you to swipe this hero cell. Typically what this is called is a hero object or hero cell. And whenever you swipe, right, you can see it snaps to the next item inside of this horizontal scroll. So using the compositional layout, scrolling behavior on the orthogonal axis, it's really easy to achieve this behavior here. And then moving on, we have the second section of categories. There's 8 items in this section, and you can see it looks really different compared to what's going on up here. And again, using the comp layout, structuring out your code to make this happen is really easy. And then thirdly, we have this section right here. You see it's somewhat similar to what's going on at the very top, but as you can tell, it doesn't have that snapping behavior. So you can also achieve this using a different scrolling behavior. And I'll show you guys exactly what the code is for that as well. And then lastly, on the last section, right? Tasty hamburgers, extra large. We have a sundae here and some milk and so on and so forth. Notice how this section has a 2-column grid style. And doing this is pretty easy. You just have to understand how to set up the section and also the groups and the items in that said section. Okay, so hopefully you guys are still with me. This type of application, especially in the App Store or on the iOS platform, it's really common. So learning how to lay out everything is a nice thing to know. And maybe it'll kind of help you impress your future employer as well. Okay, so with all of that being said, why don't I take you into the application that I have started up right here. So this is just a plain old single view application using Xcode, I think 11.5, and it has Swift UI embedded inside of it. Here's my content view, and I'm going to be working with this file for the rest of the video, so I'll close out of that guy here. Next question is, what exactly is in this file? Well, I have a food controller, which is my collection view controller. Has 8 items, has a custom initializer for my plain old flow layout here. Has some red cells inside of it, and you know, the standard cell ID, register cell, and nothing too fancy there. This stuff belongs to the preview on the right side. You can kind of see content previews. And I don't want to talk about this too much, but if you want to show your view controller on the right side, you have to make one of these view controller representable things. And inside of your make UI view controller, just return a navigation controller. And for the root, you have your class up there called food controller. So once you have all this stuff, you can kind of resume and see exactly what it renders out as in the preview on the right side. So you can hit the play, and you can just drag this up and down. Hopefully it should work. Okay, you can ignore this content view for now. We just need it to make our code compile. And the first thing I'll do is for my food controller, which is our main class right now. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna modify return 8. You can just, make this return 5, and it should work. So I'm gonna stop and hit play. Sometimes a preview is gonna require you to stop and play, but for the most part, this guy should work without having to do that. So 15, and now we have 15 red cells. Okay, so pretty awesome. Again, this is using a standard flow layout. And the whole point of today's lesson is to provide a compositional layout that allows you to achieve all of the fancy stuff of multiple sections that look really, really drastically different compared to each other. So I'll show you guys how to set up your comp layout here. So comp layout is your compositional layout. I'll be calling it a comp layout because it's a lot easier to say. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna declare a layout just like what I have up here. And the compositional layout is pretty easy to construct. You just have to go through the song and dance of opening up this guy right here with a parentheses, look at the couple of options that you have, and this one, section provider, is the easiest one to explain, so I'll use this one for today's lesson. Just hit enter one more time. You get 2 parameters for this closure block. The first one is your section number, and we have multiple sections, so I'll be using this a little later. For the environment, we don't really need this, so you can either use the environment or use an underscore. Maybe later on I'll tell you what the environment actually does. So I'll call it env for now. The last thing you need to know is this closure for your compositional layout. It wants to render out your sections inside of your collection view. So the sections will be determined by this object here. It wants you to return one of these layout section guys. So just type that out. You'll get the autocomplete. Hit a group here. And I'll just type out return section because I'll need to do that later. Next question is, what exactly is this layout section group thing? Well, I'll define a group right here. So let group equals ns layout group, and you'll get the autocomplete as well. And this group, it's going to determine what exactly your items are going to render out as inside of your sections here. And I don't want to talk about it too much because if you don't have the code to look at, it's a little hard to understand what the entire section is going to render out as. So in other words, let me type out a little bit more code here for the layout size. I'm going to use the initializer of width and height dimension, and I want to render out this top section here, right? So it has about 3 cells that are 100% width from left to right. So to determine that, I'm going to use the width of fractional width of 1. That's going to give me 100% of the width. And then for the height dimension, you can use the absolute value of something like 300. And that's going to give you, 300 height. So again, this stuff is kind of hard to understand until you see what it actually renders out as. So let me just keep on going on here. We have an item of layout items. So I'm going to create one single item that's going to render out these 3 cells here. And let me just say ns collection layout item. So when you're working with new libraries, you typically just want to type them out like this. I'm looking at this guy right here, and I'm just going to type it out and try to construct something that I understand. So this takes a lot of time to get used to, but I've been working on this for a couple of months, so I think I'm pretty used to it by now. For this guy, I'm going to use something very simple with fractional width of 1 and also dot fractional height of 1 as well. And this basically means that it's going to take up 100% of the width and also 100% of the height of the actual group right here. Right, so I understand this is somewhat confusing if you're not used to typing out the comp layout, but this is the code that you need to actually get your layout somewhat working. Okay, all of this nasty code is now working inside of my simulator here. And if you run your application now and drag it up and down, you see the right scroll bar there. if I modify the number of items to be 3, hit a space, you'll see the scroll bar is a lot longer. And you might be asking, well, what are my 3 items being rendered out as, and why is it this nasty red block? Well, the reason why the red block is showing up like that, it's because the item right here is actually rendering out 3 items that are 300 height. So this guy is about 900 pixels tall. And let me show you something that you can do. And this is the trick that I use a lot. So content inset.bottom equals to 16. So once you type some of the content insets out, you'll see your 3 items are now kind of separated off by 16 pixels of padding on the trailing and also on the bottom edge here. So this is a very good first step to kind of stop at and look at the code to understand what's going on truly. All right, good old coffee. So yeah, so far we have 3 items. You can change this to an absolute height of 200 as well. You can see I can hit the spacebar, hit the resume, and your code is going to compile again. So not too hard, hopefully. One trick that I do want to mention is that every time you make a change, you have to hit this resume button up here, and that's kind of annoying. So a trick that you can use to avoid the resume button is, I noticed that this comp layout right here, I'm going to take it and I'm going to create a static function. So create layout. This is going to return a comp layout right here. And this creates your layout, and I don't really need the variable, so I'm just going to return the layout like so. And because this is a static function, I'm going to use the food controller and use create layout like so. The reason, again, why I'm doing that is because once you have a static function like this, you can modify these values right here. So let me bring this to 400, hit a space. I don't have to hit the resume button anymore. I don't exactly know why that is, but using this static function trick right here makes your trial and error process a lot easier. So that's what I'm going to do. All right. Okay, I don't need these comments anymore, so hopefully you guys can delete them as well. Okay, so we have our 3 cells. What do we want to do next? Well, these 3 cells, right, they're supposed to represent this like top swipey section guy up here. And to do that is really, really easy now. Inside of your comp layout sections, you have this orthogonal scrolling behavior, and you can set it to whatever value you want. So continuous does that, and you can see continuous gives you this behavior here, and it basically is this guy down here. And then let's see, the other option that you have is try paging. And once you do that, you can see it snaps to the correct slot here. So that's essentially how you would render out the top section that says grab sushi and save 30%, which is a pretty good value. Okay, last thing is maybe you want to get rid of the right padding right here. So that's a trailing of 16. If you modify that to 0, you can kind of swipe left and right and you'll get this. You don't really see the separation, so I'll bring this to maybe 2. And you'll see that small little sliver of a gap on the right edge there. And I think that's pretty good. Now, I believe you guys are going to be able to render out these items inside of your cell correctly. So there's maybe a label right here with an image on the right side and some kind of gradient. I don't want to exactly go through rendering out the cell because that's not the important part of today's lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and move on and try to render out this second section with the categories at the bottom there. So moving on, let's see, this is your first section. And let's see, I'm going to go ahead and override another method of the collection view. I'm just looking at my time here. I have 17 minutes, so that's pretty good. I'm going to change this to render out 2. If you don't have any other lines of code, you can just hit a 2. You don't need a return anymore. So once you do that, you have 2 sections that you can kind of swipe like so. Okay, so not too shabby for a quick 15 or so minutes. Next thing I'll do is I want to render out this second section with the header and the 8 cells. And the way I'm going to do that is maybe a number of items in section right here. You can simply say if the section is the first section, return 3. And then if it's the second section, return 8, like so. So there's now 8 cells down below. And like I was mentioning earlier in the lesson, you can check the section number there. So section number, if it's the first section, then we'll do what we just did a few minutes ago. Otherwise, for all other sections, we'll try to return a different looking section. I do apologize, I think my voice is going a little bit, so I'll try to get this thing done as quickly as I can. Layout section right here, and you basically have to go through the song and dance every time you need to create a section. So just look at that code and try to get familiar with it. All right, so as you can see, we have our second section right here, and we're currently missing the definition of our group, which I'll make up above. The group is going to be defined pretty similar to what I have up here. It's going to look a little bit different, however. So layout group. For this guy, you can choose horizontal and vertical. Maybe I'll explain what the difference is later on. But for today's example, it doesn't really matter so much. So I'll just use horizontal for now. For the layout size, I'll tell you what I want to use. I'll pick the fractional width of 1. So I'm going to try to span the full width of left and right for my entire group. And I'll make these guys a lot smaller by controlling the actual item instead. For the height dimension, this guy, I'm going to use the estimated value of 500. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm going to let the item's height control the actual height instead of the group. So if you don't know exactly how tall your group needs to be, using the estimated value is probably the right thing to do. The 500 is just some random value that seems to work for me, so that's what I'll do. For the last parameter, I'm going to define my item right here. And you might be asking, why is this guy an array? Well, a group can contain multiple items. I'll maybe talk about that in another video and tell you why it's useful. But for today's lesson, just follow what I'm doing and you should be okay. Define my item here. So let's again open this guy up. For the width dimension, I'm going to use an absolute value of, let's say, I don't know, 50, and also absolute value of 50. And let's try to kind of see what this guy shows up as, right? You can see you can swipe this guy left and right like usual, but this guy is showing up as a wide bar. You might be wondering, well, why is it doing that? Well, the reason why it's actually doing that is because right here, somewhere right here, right, you actually are rendering out the items. And what you're going to do is I'm going to say item.contentInset.trailing again. And I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to set a 16 for the right side. And you can, right after that change, you can tell what's going on exactly. So with this trick, it's really helpful. So I'm going to use the bottom of, let's see, trailing, and also this guy 16. If you modify this value to be, I don't know, return something like 24, which is another multiple, or maybe 16 is better. So 16, hit space, this will render out. Now you have 16 cells like that. Okay, let me bring this back down to 8. And instead of using the absolute value of 50, right, I need my cells to be rendered out as 1/4 of the entire width minus all the padding in between. So there's padding here, here, and here. And you might attempt to do some math to calculate the width, but you don't really have to do that anymore using a compositional layout because you have the control of using a fractional value. So to make this easy to understand, I'm just going to type out the answer for you. For the width dimension, like let's say you modify this to be 100, right? 100 now looks like that. And it doesn't exactly match what we want. So what I'll do is I'm going to modify this to be the fractional width of 0.25. It's going to now look like that right there. So pretty good stuff. If I want to introduce a left trailing or left leading padding value, you can either do it on the group or the section. So in other words, content inset dot leading equals 16. That should work right here. You can also introduce it for the group as well, which I think is better. So I'm going to use 16 here. So there's two 16 values. Let me comment that out right there. So I'll use that on the section because I think I want to move the category later on to the right by 16 as well. So I'll put it on the entire section. Okay, so far so good. If you modify the absolute height dimension here to, I don't know, maybe 150, hit a space, you'll get this to start rendering out here. So yeah, with the compositional layout, as you can tell, rendering out really different looking sections is just super straightforward right now. You no longer have to go through the weird width calculation of your cells, and just use 0.25 and everything should just magically work out. Okay, last thing about the second section is maybe I'll show you guys how to render out this categories guy here. So how do I want to do that? Well, this guy's really hard to explain, to be honest. Inside of your sections, right, you can declare this boundary supplementary items array, and this guy is responsible for rendering out your headers and your footers and all your like decorator views, I think. This guy, there's a lot of different options. I'll just use this one and try to explain what's going on. So layout size is very similar to what we've been doing all along for the width dimension. I'm going to use the fractional width of 1 because I want this header right here, the categories header, I want it to span full width. It doesn't really matter, but that's what I'll use, and I'll give it a height of 50 as well. The element kind is a little strange, so I'll move on to this guy right here. Hit dot, you can render out your header anywhere you want. So I'll use top leading, which means the top left if you're in the United States. So just use top leading and you'll be fine. The element kind, again, this guy is tricky. So it doesn't have to be, it has to be a string, but it doesn't have to be anything fancy. So this guy is a static function, you know, static create function. I'll create a static string here, which I'll use later on as well. So static let, and I'll say category header ID equals just some arbitrary string. It doesn't have to be like that, but it's convenient for me to create the string like so. And you know, that's what I'll do. I'm going to hit try again, and hopefully something's going to render out. I'm going to try again until finally the screen shows up correctly. You can see there's now this large gap of 50 for the actual header inside of your collection view. Obviously, you can modify that to be a lot larger, and you'll see the change right here to be 150. Let's bring that down to 50. And I'll tell you how to render out this categories header right now. It's nothing too fancy, but if you are familiar with the collection view, right, you render out your headers and your footers through this method right here, supplementary element of kind. And let's just say let header equals collection view DQ supplementary view, and the kind is going to come from here. So of kind, take that. The index path is this. And the tricky part is the reuse identifier, right? So let me just return my header for now. And the reuse identifier, it can be any type of string that you want. So I'm going to make maybe another, I don't know, header ID, I guess. So let's use this right here and just do that. I think that should work. And if you try to resume right now, it's going to run this method for that empty space header that you saw before. But it's going to crash, and if you run it in the simulator, it'll tell you exactly what the crash is. But basically, the crash is because you haven't registered this header ID for a header. And this is a lot of boring code that I don't exactly want to talk about, but you have to use some kind of view class, and it has to be a reusable view.self. For the kind, you can use the food controller.category header ID. Reuse identifier is the header ID, and now your code is compiling again. The header right here, you can actually see it if you change the background color to blue. So now your header is right here. Okay, so that's pretty much how that works. If you want to render out the categories label, do I want to show you guys how to do that? I mean, I might as well for completeness rather. So this is your header, UI collection reusable view, init frame, super init frame. Frame is here, let label equals UI label. So this isn't exactly how I would do this in a production application, but I'll just do it for you guys to see right now. Add subview of this label somewhere here. And you should really use constraints to lay this guy out, but let's see, that guy, Command Option Control F will actually take care of that. I think that's new, but just do that. And let's see, what else do we got to do here? I'm going to say setup, layout subviews, super layout subviews, and this guy is header.bounds, label.bounds. So I actually want to control this guy right here. So let's do that, layout.bounds equals self.frame. And that's basically going to render out my categories label. I'm going to now use this header instead of this kind of placeholder header thing right there. And now if I hit resume, you should see something inside of my header. And maybe this guy is frame and this guy is bounds. So don't exactly ask me why that is. Frames and bounds is just the coordinate system of the actual view. It takes a lot to explain exactly why that is, but just take my word for it. It should work if you just have frames and bounds correct. So everything is looking pretty good. Obviously, you can modify the categories font to be bold and whatnot. The reason why there's a space right here, it might not be obvious, but for the first section up here, I have the bottom content inset to be 16. And that means that for these cells right here, there's a padding of 16 on the bottom. So once you get rid of it, everything is looking nice and clean. Okay, a lot of work so far. So let me take a quick drink break. And we'll try to move on to the third section. Some of you guys can probably guess how this is done. Pretty similar to what we have as the first section. And then we have the final section on the very bottom. So again, for completeness, I will render out a third section here. Number of sections is now 3. We get that. Hopefully this stuff is helpful for you guys to see. I don't know if any of you guys are still with me for today's video. Section number is equal to 1. Let me know if this stuff is helpful because I don't know how much I can do before I lose most of you guys. The last section, so section 1 is what we just typed out. I don't need that guy anymore. I don't like my comments, so I'll get rid of it. Let me just type this out as fast as I can. Again, I'm trying to render out this section right here. So just the little swipey guy. Return the section is that here is my group. Let group equals ns layout group. This guy, let's use horizontal. Let's use that right here. Layout size. This one might be a little tricky. So let's use the fractional width of 1 and then the height dimension of, I don't know, the absolute value of 50. So this guy is looking really small. Maybe 125 is better. Item array right here. And what exactly is my item? Well, you can just say item right here and init with the width dimension of, so again, this is somewhat tricky. So fractional height of 1. So fractional height of 1, what this means is it's going to take up all of the group's height of 125. And hopefully that's straightforward. So I'm not going to talk about that any further. For this guy, I'll use the fractional width of 1 as well. Okay, that looks pretty good. We have this guy right here, which is a large blob. Item.trailing, so item.content inset.trailing is what I want. So that looks okay. We have that on the right side. You can change the bottom as well, but the fix for this is to use the continuous orthogonal scrolling behavior. And now you have this inside of your third section. Not too bad, as you can tell. Typing out the code wasn't that bad, hopefully. So hopefully you guys were able to follow along. To make it look like this right here with the right side of maybe 32, let me just put a 32 here. And to have this peaking cell on the right edge coming in, let's see, how do I want to do that? So this is fractional width of 1. Let's bring this down to 0.8 to see what happens. And you can see having 80% of the width for your item cells is going to give this effect here. So you can drag and drag and drag. There's a lot of different configurations that you can play around with. Like maybe you want to use 0.8 here and take this to 1, right? So you can kind of see if the group is taking the entire width of 100% here, and if the item is taking 80%, you get this effect. So this is not what I want, and I just wanted to show you guys the difference between the item taking 100% versus the group taking 100% of the width. Okay, so let me undo this and bring it back down to the group taking 0.8. And that's what you get. So last thing is maybe you want the section content inset dot leading to be 16. I don't know, seems to be okay. That's the design that I have right here. And so that's what I'll use for now. All right, looks like I'm hitting the 40-so-ish minute mark of today's video. So I'll try to wrap up this lesson by moving on to the last section here. You can kind of guess, right? This section is pretty similar to the second section, the categories. And instead of taking a fourth of the entire width, you're just going to take a half, 1/2. So I'll do this again for completeness. And I do encourage a lot of you guys to try to code along with me on this exercise. So this looks good. This is the last section. I'm going to check the section number again if this is the third section, which is 2. Do that. I think I might copy and paste this code. So if you really know what you're doing, you can start copying and pasting. Is it better if I type out the code slowly? Okay, maybe I'll type out the code. Okay, this guy is the layout section. Your group guy right here. So group. La-di-da-da-da, and let group equals ns layout group. I can show you what the vertical guy does instead. So let's use the vertical one. Layout size, this is the init fractional width of 1, and then this guy is the estimate value of, let's say, 200. You can use 1,000. So let's see, 1,000, and this guy is your item. Again, I'm trying to render out this last section here. It might not be that obvious, but it's kind of hard to explain this stuff if you just try to explain every line without having the full picture. So this is what I'll do. With dimension, I'm going to use the fractional width of 0.25 or 0.5, and this guy, I don't know, absolute value of whatever these cells are, and you'll see I get this effect here now. Doesn't look too bad, but I don't have my 2 column going. And why exactly is that? Well, I want to say item.content_inset.bottom. Let's make sure I have 16 on the bottom right here. So that's looking pretty good. And this is the fractional width of 0.5. And let's say item.content_inset.trailing equals 16 as well. So that looks okay. And I believe the difference between vertical and horizontal right here is actually causing this problem. So I'm going to change this to horizontal, and I believe it should work. So horizontal looks like that. Again, there's quite a big difference between vertical and horizontal. I believe now if your array, right? So typically this is an array of 5 objects. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, 8. And that's the horizontal orientation. If you have vertical, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, we don't have objects to render out, so it's hard to see that in action. So I'm just going to leave it to your imagination to work that out. Okay, looks like my two column grid is going quite well. The rendering is going quite well. For the section, you can say section dot content inset. This guy you can actually say init right here. I don't know, 32000. You can do that as well, and you'll get some padding on the top. You can use a 16 here, and that'll do that. All of your cells are red right now. And again, the reason why the cells are red is because inside of the self-item you have your background color equals dot red. To render out each of your cells, you have to register your cells right here to, render out your images, your labels, and whatnot. So that's kind of beyond the scope of today's lesson. The last thing I want to talk about to kind of wrap up today's video is to explain one of the more useful things about the compositional layout right now. So in the traditional methodology of constructing this type of application, prior to iOS 13, what you have to do is you have to embed a lot of collection views inside of other collection views. So this guy right here, maybe like this whole vertical thing is one collection view. This guy up here is a horizontal collection view. This guy right here is another horizontal collection view. And so that's the past traditional way of constructing this app. And now you don't have to do that anymore. And one of the huge benefits of this is that if you want to correspond or if you want to respond to the selection of any of these cells, right? So let's say I click on the first guy, it brings in a red view, click on the second guy, the second section brings in a blue view, this guy brings in a yellow, this guy brings in a purple. Controlling that is now really easy. And because you have one single collection view, you can just type in did select item add, and it gives you the index path. So what do I want to say about this? Let's say UI view controller dot view dot background color equals, let's say index path dot section. If it's the first section, let's use yellow. Otherwise, use something like blue. Navigation controller dot push view controller equals the controller, and animation is true. Okay, so a little bit of code, but it's pretty easy to see what's going on. Click on that, you get your yellow. Click on this, you get your blue. Down here should be blue as well. So again, controlling what happens whenever you tap on an item is very easy to accomplish right now because you just have to override one single did select item add. In the past, you had a lot of collection views embedded inside of each other. And when you click the embedded collection view, maybe this guy right here, you have to bubble up that action to the parent controller and then tell it exactly which item you clicked on. So I think some of you guys are familiar with how that's done. And it's not a lot of fun, and your code quickly gets super messy. And I guess the last thing I'll try to go over is if you take a look at the code that you have, you're not implementing any type of hacks. You have the number of sections right here, number of items per section. Everything is fairly straightforward and nothing is too confusing. If you come back to your code maybe a couple of months from now and look at it, you can quickly understand what's going on, as opposed to the old way of doing things. And the one tricky part of all this is to correctly declare your compositional layout. And honestly, typing out a lot of this code, it's confusing like the first 10 times you do this, but once you get over the initial learning curve, it becomes a really easy and like pretty straightforward in my opinion. But again, it does take a while to get used to. I've been doing this for I think the last couple of months, and I have a production application on the App Store that uses the compositional layout to render out some like video streams and whatnot. And I find using the comp layout to be a super straightforward and also just really, really easy and a really direct way of rendering out these types of applications. Not every application is going to be able to use the compositional layout, but if you have something that's mildly advanced like this, I do suggest looking into the comp layout. The last thing, I think this video is going on for too long, but I think the last thing I'll say about the comp layout is that You have this estimated value, so estimated right here. And one of the most powerful things about this estimated value, which I'm not showing in today's lesson, and I'll talk about it in a later video, is that inside of your collection view, right? Sometimes you need to have the cells be like a perfect height depending on the contents inside of it. Like maybe you'll have a lot of text and the text will wrap multiple lines and you don't really know until runtime. So using the estimated height right here for the actual item, so you can specify estimated here. Using estimated, the actual collection view, the OS, is actually going to estimate the cell's height instead of you manually calculating it. So previously, you maybe have to use like system layout fitting size, some magical black magic art to guess the size of your cell. You no longer have to do that, and you can just use the estimated here. Again, that might sound a little bit crazy, and you might not know what I'm talking about, but later on I'll try to explain exactly how that estimated height calculation really works. Okay, so that's going to be it for today's video. Hopefully you were able to take away some knowledge. Again, there's a lot of crazy things going on in the real world right now. A lot of protests, a lot of civil unrest. There's a global pandemic. And then something else that's scary is the massive unemployment that we have in the second half of 2020. I don't know how everything's going to unfold, but I guess the silver lining of all this is that the stock market is surprisingly, it's not only is it stable, but it's actually it's not crashing and it's actually increasing with all the strange things going on right now. Okay, so enough for today. I'll try to put a shorter lesson on the next video that I launch, but I'll be recording more videos in the second half of 2020. I'm still waiting for WWDC 2020 to kind of showcase what exactly is new and how Swift UI is going to improve upon Swift 1.0 or Swift UI 1.0. And if things change drastically, if there's a lot of improvements in Swift UI 2.0, then I'll start pushing out Swift UI tutorials, because right now Swift UI is the foundation is a little shaky. So that's why I haven't been putting out too much content regarding that framework. Okay, so yeah, again, hopefully you guys are staying safe out there, and if you want to download the source code, it's available down in the description below. So I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Ciao.